Oh, good morning. It's good to be with you once again. It's good to see a nice number gathered here this morning. We're going to continue with our series of studies in the time of Babylon and Persia. And we're going to look this morning at the story of Esther. Now, I know a lot of you who know the story of Esther will be cheered by the thought that we're going to look at this wonderful story, because it is one of the most remarkable stories in the Bible. It's remarkable in a number of ways. And one of the ways that the scholars often remark on is, why is this book in the Bible? It doesn't mention God. There's no mention of God in the book of Esther. But when we read the story of Esther, we find the providential dealing of God all the way through. At the end, we're going to return to perhaps the reason why it doesn't mention God. The timing of the book, and why are we studying it before we look at the book of Nehemiah, having just done Ezra, is quite simple, one of historical fact, because the book of Esther, when we studied Ezra, we noted that Ezra was in two parts. It could be called Zerubbabel in Ezra. And Zerubbabel went up to Jerusalem following the decree of Cyrus the Great. But Ezra went up to Jerusalem following the decree of Artaxerxes. And between those two goings up is a period of 80 years. And when we read Ezra, we noticed that it took them 20 years to complete the temple. And then between chapter 6 and chapter 7 of Ezra, there's a gap of 60 years. And Esther fits into that gap. So Esther historically comes before Nehemiah. She actually comes before Ezra's return to Jerusalem. The king on the throne was Ahasuerus, also known as Xerxes I, and he ruled, we know from Persian history, from 485 BC. He ruled for a period of 20 years or so. He was a despotic king. History records a great deal against him and about him. He attempted many campaigns against the up-and-coming empire of the Greeks, not always successfully, and all sorts of historical and sometimes humorous stories are told about his anxiety and wrath because he failed in those campaigns to begin with. However, having put it in its historical context, we also note that it belongs to that period, and we are talking, you remember, about how these empires rose and fell. How the Assyrian Empire based on Nineveh came up first, and they first attacked the Jews in Jerusalem and carried away the 10 northern tribes, as it were, at the fall of Samaria. And then the Babylonians took over from the Assyrians. And under Nebuchadnezzar, of course, we know they carried the Jews captive away to Babylon. But then the Persians, the Medes and the Persians, rose up as a powerful force. So you are moving eastward in the center of power, from Nineveh to Babylon to Susa. Susa still exists. You can still visit it. The archaeological finds at Susa are completely remarkable. The city is there, but the citadel is also there. It's separate from the city, and that's the palace grounds, as it were. And the archaeology surrounding Susa has confirmed the historical accuracy of our Bible. It's an amazing story of how this has been confirmed. I visited Susa, and there in Susa you'll find the tomb of Daniel. Not sure it's exactly there in Daniel, but he may have been taken from Babylon in present-day Iraq to Susa in present-day Iran. So we get the setting. But the Persian Empire is something astonishing. And Esther begins, and I want you to open your Bibles at Esther and keep them open, because we're going to do a bit of a Bible study for the first part, and then we'll draw some messages from it towards the end. You will find in the beginning of the book of Esther the story of Ahasuerus, who reigned from India to Ethiopia. I don't know how good your geography is, but that's the entirety of the Middle East and North Africa. He put together the empires which had gone before him, subjugated them and incorporated them all into one great empire. 127 provinces, 127 governors. And as we said before, a postal service that was the rival of the world and the fastest in the world up until the age of steam. He could get messages to any province in his empire in 7 days, riding on the king's highway in horses, which Esther tells us were specially fast horses bred from the king's own stud. Like the Pony Express, like a relay race, they changed horses all the way out, and they could get a message right across the empire. This is important historic reality. What was said about the Persian postal service is carved as an inscription over the United States Postal Service main office in New York. That neither cold nor wind or storm or tempest would delay the delivery of the post. And I think as said before, I don't know if anybody has ever watched Cheers, but Cliff Clavin in Cheers, the Postal, used to quote that and say, "That's what we do, I'm a postman, that's what we do," and used to bore all his fellow drinkers with that tale. But it didn't belong to the US Postal Service, it belonged to the Postal Service of Cyrus the Great. That's what they established. Why are these details important? Because Esther is about messages that go out to all 127 provinces. And from Esther we discover that there are Jews in every one of the 127 provinces. They have been taken at different times by different empires, but they're all now incorporated into one empire. And in the story of Esther, you know they are under threat. Because if the story of Ezra is one of restoration under Zerubbabel and Ezra, and the story of Nehemiah is one of reconstruction, as we know it is, both of the city walls and of the people itself, then the story of Esther is one of preservation. Preservation. Within the vast Persian Empire, a people are under threat and they are preserved in the story of Esther. We're introduced to the story, and I won't be going through all 10 chapters in detail. I'll direct your attention to certain passages. You can read it at home. It doesn't take long to read. It's a marvelous story. And the first thing that we are introduced to is an insight into the grandeur and the wealth and the splendor and the riches of the rulers of the Persian Empire. We think that Buckingham Palace is a great place to go and visit. Well, Buckingham Palace is a bit like a council house when compared to the citadel at Susa. If you don't believe me, just read Esther. Go down in chapter 1 to verse 6, when the king has a feast for 7 days. There were white cotton curtains and violet hangings fastened with cords of fine linen and purple to silver rods, and marble pillars and also couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl and precious stones. Drinks were served in golden vessels, vessels of different kinds, and the royal wine was lavished according to the bounty of the king, and drinking was according to this edict: there is no compulsion. For the king had given orders to all the staff of his palace to do as each man desired. You get an insight into the opulence and perhaps the decadence of the court of the ruler of Persia. If you think any of this is an over-elaborate description, just visit the British Museum when you're next in London and go into the Persian section, and there you will see the artifacts for yourself. We're told also that the king had a queen. Her name was Vashti. She's a remarkable woman, is Vashti. Nothing is said against her in Esther. She's a very courageous woman. Her name means simply beautiful woman. If you are the ruler of the Persian Empire, you have the pick of the whole empire, and he already had his chosen queen. She was considered the most beautiful in the land. She was also giving a feast for all the ladies. There had come together all these people from all over the province for a 6-month council. History tells us it was doubtless a council about how they were going to wage a campaign against the Greeks. But at the end of the council, after 180 days, he gives this 7-day feast. 7-day feasts were commonplace in this particular court. And at the same time, Vashti has set a feast for the women who had come with them. So the men and women are separated into 2 different feasts. But towards the end of the feast, when wine had been taken copiously, the king wants to show Vashti off. Now, Vashti was a feminist. You'd be surprised to know. And there is no way that she was going to parade herself in front of this debauched company. Now, that was quite a courageous thing to do. And of course, the edict eventually comes that she is to be banished from the king's presence. And it's interesting to read in chapter 2 of how this comes about, because the men all take counsel with one another, and they say things which are quite remarkable. Look in chapter 2, at the end of chapter 1, in verse 17. For the queen's behavior will be made known to all women, causing them to look at their husbands with contempt. Since they will say, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought to him, and she did not come. This very day, the noble women of Persia and Media, who have heard of the queen's behavior, will say the same to all the king's officials, and there'll be contempt and wrath in plenty. We can't have this. We can't have women speaking up. And at the very end of the chapter, this advice pleased the king and the princes, and the king did as Memucan proposed. He sent letters to all the royal provinces, to every province in its own script and to every people in its own language, that every man be master in his own household and speak according to the language of his people. Now, all my life I've grown up with the notion that I have lived through a period of male dominance. It came as a surprise to me, actually, to learn that I grew up in a period of male dominance and that every man was master in his own house. I grew up with 5 sisters. I grew up with 1 wife and 2 daughters. I have 12 nieces. In my house, it was only the dog and me was male. Everything else was female. But we talk of male dominance, but there once was male dominance by royal decree. Every man will be master in his own house. This was the result of Queen Vashti not wanting to display herself at Ahasuerus' party. It's very telling. It happens in the 3rd year of his reign. And 4 years later, in the 7th year of his reign, a new queen is installed. We find that out in chapter 2. And there's a beauty pageant. And messages are sent to every one of the provinces. Send me your local beauty queen. And there's going to be a competition for who is going to be the next queen. the chosen few will gather, and they'll be given a 1-year makeover. If you ladies occasionally have a spa treatment or something similar, just see what happened to the contenders for Queen of Persia. 6 months with the oils and the perfume preparations, and another 6 months with the spices and adornments to bring them to their absolute finest. And here we are introduced for the first time to one of the heroes of the story. Chapter 2, verse 5. Now there was a Jew in Susa, the citadel. It's from Esther that we begin to realize that the children of Israel, of the 12 tribes, the Hebrews, meaning literally from beyond the river, are categorized in the Persian Empire by a single name. They are called Jews, and they will be called Jews forever after that. They won't be called Simeonites or Levites or Benjamites or Reubenites. They'll simply be called Jews, which technically means from Judah. But it becomes the term for all those who trust in the Lord Jehovah, all the Jewish people in captivity. And this particular Jew, his name was Mordecai. We're told he is the son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives, carried away with Jeconiah, the king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, the daughter of his uncle. He has a cousin, younger than him, much younger than him. She's a Hebrew girl, a Jewish girl. Her name is Hadassah, which means myrtle. But from the beginning, she's given a Persian name, Esther. It's strange, isn't it, that to this day, one of the most popular names for a Jewish girl is Esther, but it's actually a Persian name, and it means star. She was called Myrtle, and her name was changed to Star. Her name was changed, and lots of things were changed about her, we shall later find in the story, because Mordecai, being protective of his ward, wants to protect her from the dangers and the threat of being a Jew living in exile. And so we are introduced to this remarkable young woman. We are told the young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. And when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. Mordecai, we're to learn, lived at the king's gate, not in the city of Susa, but in the citadel of Susa. He was a servant of Ahasuerus. He held an important position in the king's civil service, as it was. He was as close to the king as it was possible to get. He even lived near the palace. And after searching the empire far and wide, they came to discover Esther, living with her guardian and protector Mordecai. And she was put forward as one of the more beautiful in the land. Well, we know what began to happen next, because after the year of preparation of all these young girls had passed and all the perfuming and everything had taken place, Esther was chosen by the king to be his queen. Now Mordecai has someone inside the palace. He can't see her. He has to send messages back and forth to her, because now she's under the guardianship of the king. And the first thing that happens, we find at the end of chapter 2, is that a plot is hatched within the palace, within the guardians of the palace, to assassinate the king. And Mordecai, sitting at his house near the gate, comes to hear of this plot. And as a loyal subject, he sends a message to Esther through an intermediary, tell the king about this plot. And the plot is discovered, and the two servants who were attempting this coup within the palace are found guilty, and they are hanged. And it is recorded in their archive, in their chronicles. Now, by this time you should understand, and I'm sure you do, that this recording into the chronicles is a key feature of all these books of the Babylonian period, because later kings are going to discover those recordings, or this king is going to find it out for himself. Mordecai's part in saving the king's life is recorded in the palace chronicles we find at the end of chapter 2. Now, if this were a Jewish audience, in chapter 3, when I mention the name of Haman, you should all hiss. You should all hiss and boo. Haman is the pantomime character of Jewish life. At the Feast of Purim, when they tell the story again, all the children are trained to shout out every time Haman's name is mentioned. But that's much later, of course. That's their tradition. This Haman is a real character. We discover later in the chapter that another 5 years has passed. Esther has been queen for 5 years. And Haman arrives. And Haman himself will say later, to his wife in particular, how he receives a series of rapid promotions. He rises up the ranks at a giddying speed until he is the top man in the empire next to the king. He's full of himself. He has reached the pinnacle of his career. Of course, having reached the pinnacle of his career, he expects everybody else to bow down to him. And they all gladly do so, because this is a very, very strict society. But one man doesn't bow down to him. He's Mordecai. And Haman begins to ask the question as to why Mordecai wouldn't bow down to him. You find it in chapter 3. Verse 4. When they spoke to him day after day and he would not listen to them, they told Haman, in order to see whether Mordecai's words would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage to him, Haman was filled with fury. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. So as they had made known to him the people of Mordecai, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. He sets up a plan. His plan is to discuss this, and they discuss it for a year. And they cast lots, they vote for a year, and they hatch this plan. And the plan is nothing less, nothing more than the eradication of all the Jews in the Persian Empire. And this is what Haman said to the king. If you go to chapter 3 and verse 8. Then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, there's a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of every other people. They do not keep the king's laws, though it's not to the king's profit to tolerate them. If it please the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed, and I'll pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who have charge of the king's business they may put into the king's treasures. So the king took his signet ring from his hand, gave it to Haman the Agagite, son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. The king said to Haman, "The money is given to you, the people also, to do with them as it seems good to you." And so they got together. At the beginning of the year, in the first month, and they made a decree that on one single day at the end of the year, in the 12th month, all the Jews and all the provinces of Persia would be killed. Verse 13 of chapter 3. Letters were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with instruction to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all Jews, young and old, women and children, in one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. A copy of the document was to be issued as a decree in every province by proclamation to all the peoples to be ready for that day. The couriers went out hurriedly by order of the king. The decree was issued in Susa, the citadel, and the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was thrown into confusion. Here is the crisis. They have a 12 months warning, but on a certain day, they are to be eliminated. Well, I'm sure you're familiar with the story, but the plotting of the story, the scheming of the story, the intent and purpose of the story, even when read 2,500 years later, it's quite chilling. It's quite astonishing. Old and young, women, men, children, they're all to be annihilated. To get at one man, to get at Mordecai. In order to kill Mordecai, because he wouldn't bow down to Haman, but Haman has hatred in his heart. Throughout the book, he's described as the one who hates the Jews. Did he have previous history? We don't know. But he uses this in order to execute his plan. He offers a vast sum of money, unbelievable sum of money. The king gives it back to him, saying, "Now use it for your plan." So the resources are there, and the decree is sent out. Chapter 4, when Mordecai learns of it, of course, he goes into mourning. You remember the opening of the book of Nehemiah? When Nehemiah heard how the city wall of Jerusalem was broken down, he goes into the king's presence and his countenance is sad. And the king says to him, "Why are you so sad?" He says, "Because of the state of Jerusalem." Well, Mordecai is risking death also because he's dressing in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther hears of it, she sends him a robe, saying, "Wear this instead, don't." But he won't. He's in mourning. He's in mourning, and he's gone out in public. When Mordecai, chapter 4, learned all that had been done, Mordecai tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, went out into the midst of the city, and he cried out with loud and a bitter cry. He went up to the entrance of the king's gate, for no one was allowed to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. And in every province, wherever the king's command and his decree reached, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting and weeping and lamenting, and many of them lay in sackcloth and ashes. God isn't mentioned in the book, but who were they praying to? Who were they fasting before? Who were they dressed in sackcloth and ashes? And why? Well, they realized, along with so many before them, that they were partly responsible for their situation. They had been taken into captivity because of their disobedience. They had been assimilated into the Persian Empire. Many of them were comfortable there, and now they find they're under threat. Let's move on with the story. Word comes from Mordecai back to Esther in verse 14. of chapter 4. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, hold a fast on my behalf. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it's against the law, and if I perish, I perish. Mordecai then went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. These two references are perhaps the most famous in the book of Esther. Mordecai says to her, maybe this is why you're here, Esther. Maybe this is your purpose in life. This may be why you're so beautiful. It's not genetic, it's divine. You're in the king's palace, Esther. And God in his providence has ensured that the king has chosen you. And you're Jewish. And you've hidden your Jewish identity. And the king doesn't know that you're Jewish. You have a Persian name. You're stunningly beautiful. But maybe this is why you're here. And Esther, equally accepting of the providential dealing of God in the whole matter, she said, will you pray for me? Will you fast for me for 3 days? Because on the 3rd day, I will go in. I haven't seen him for a month. And if I go in uninvited, he'll condemn me and banish me. Unless his heart is moved towards me. And we know the story, how she goes in. And she stood in the inner court of the house in chapter 5 in front of the king's quarters. Verse 2, and when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won favor in his sight, and he held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. And the king said to her, what is it, Queen Esther? What's your request that shall be given you even half of the kingdom? And she says, if it please the king, I'd like to make a feast for you and Haman. That sounds reasonable. Of course, Haman thinks this is a wonderful thing. Not only is he a most important person in the land, but he's now been invited to a special audience of the king and queen. Nobody else has been invited. They're the 2 guests of honor. But she doesn't reveal her hand at that first feast. Because at the first feast, she says, I'm going to prepare a second feast. We find that in verse 8. If it please the king to grant my wish and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come to the feast, and I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king has said. Haman, flushed in his success, he goes away and he tells his wife, I've been invited to the palace tomorrow. They're going to give me some honor. And it's all very exciting for him. And then something strange happens, chapter 6. The king can't sleep. He can't sleep because he's troubled. And he wakes up early and he gets his courtiers around him and he asks them, bring me some of the chronicles. There's something puzzling me. And there he reads in the chronicles how Mordecai once saved his life. Whatever happened to Mordecai, he said. Did we knight him? Did we give him the MBE or the equivalent in Persia? No, nothing happened to him. Well, something should happen to him. Is there anybody here in the court that's important? Well, Haman was in the court. Ask Haman to come in. And then the wonderful story. What should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Haman said, this is it. This is my chance. And so he tells the king what he thinks. This man, whoever it is, I don't know, but this man, whoever it is the king decides to honor, should have royal robes that the king once wore. He should ride on a horse that the king once rode on. He should wear a crown that the king once wore. And the king said, that's brilliant, Haman. That's exactly what I think should happen. Now I want you to go and find Mordecai and dress him in one of my robes and put him on one of my horses and give him one of my crowns. And Haman realizes too late the game is up. The most famous, perhaps, analogy from Esther is that the gallows that Mordecai prepared for Mordecai are the gallows that they hanged Haman and his 10 sons on. You can read the rest of the story, how it plays out, how when that appointed day came, a new decree had been written that the Jews could protect themselves and avenge themselves on those that had threatened them. And so God preserved for them an entire people through the work of Esther. Read it for yourself. It's a wonderful and elaborate story. But I want to draw some lessons from it. And the first lesson that we must face is that the story of Esther has a backstory. And the backstory is the Jews in the Persian Empire, the Persian Jews. And we have a question. Why are they still there? 50 years before, read it at the beginning of Esther, read it at the end of Chronicles, Cyrus the Great put out a decree. Every single Jew in all the provinces of my empire should go back to Jerusalem, build a temple in the city. You're free to go. Story of Esther's 50 years later. Only a few of them went. Only a remnant went with Zerubbabel. Only a handful went with Ezra. The rest stayed. Why? Well, 2 generations have passed since they were migrants, immigrants, captives. They've been successful in Babylon. They've been successful in Persia. They're in all sorts of prominent positions. They have homes and businesses, and prosperous lives. And the choice is this: go back to a ruined city and broken homes, or stay here in Babylon, where we've made a good life for ourselves. And we know they stayed. And they stayed until the Second Gulf War. The last synagogue closed in Baghdad after the fall of Saddam Hussein. Turn to the beginning of the Acts of the Apostles and see on the day of Pentecost, there's Jews from all over the world. And Luke, the writer, says they're there from Mesopotamia and Media and the Elamites. All the Jews of the Persian Empire, 500 years after the decree of Cyrus, are still in the Persian Empire. That day of Pentecost, that first day of Pentecost, tells us that they went to Jerusalem. They went to Jerusalem for the feasts, but then they went back to Babylon and Persia. In Babylon, they wrote the Babylonian Talmud. You can still buy a copy. In fact, if you've got a Kindle, you can do what I did. You can download it for about £3.25, I think, the whole of the Babylonian Talmud. Written in Babylon. The great scholarship of the Jewish synagogues happened in Babylon. They were comfortable there. They visited Jerusalem, but they lived in Babylon. Now, what is Babylon? If Egypt was the world without God, the world that we are to reach, Babylon represents throughout the scriptures the world against God. And our Bible isn't finished with Babylon. Read Revelation 17 and 18 and you read all about Babylon. Well, Babylon's been gone for years. But Babylon will always exist until the end, the very end, the world against God. So one of the lessons we can learn from Esther is this. We all, whatever generation we belong to, have a decision to make. Where is our life centered? Do we visit Jerusalem on a Sunday and go back to Babylon for the rest of the time? Are we comfortable here, or are we uncomfortable here? When I was a young man, a long time ago obviously, we had a silly but quite serious chorus. You say, how could it be silly and serious? Well, it was. It was quite trite, but it was quite serious. I want to be more than a Sunday go-to-meeting Christian. I want a Saviour who's with me day by day. Saying amen to the preacher is fine if through the week you let your light shine. I want to be more than a Sunday go-to-meeting Christian. We all have that decision to make in every generation. What comes first? Is God first? Is God everything? If so, you'll want to be with the people of God, doing the work of God. You say, well, I've got my work to do. I know you've got your work to do, and you can do that to the glory of God as well. I was 50 years in the construction industry, and some of them wondered why I carried on in some of the most inhospitable places. And I was challenged on it one day. Why do you keep trying your best? And this company's terrible, and this situation is terrible. And I said, well, I'm not doing it for them. And I wasn't. What's central to your life? I grew up with men for whom their local church was everything. It was more to them than holidays. It was more to them than life itself. Because they were God's people. Placed. Perhaps that's why you're here, Esther. Perhaps that's why you're here. And we have the same challenge to face. But I want to close with something else. We think of this story as a 2,500-year-old story of the exotic times of the Persian Empire, never to be repeated, but it has been repeated many times. And my Bible tells me it's going to be repeated again. Because if Esther has a backstory, it also has a front story. And at the same time as Esther, or just maybe slightly before, we have the story of Daniel. And read in chapter 7 and chapter 9 what he sees in a vision. And he sees someone rising up rapidly at the end of time. He sees the vision of a beast with 10 horns, and one horn becomes prominent. And he wages war against the people of God until he's destroyed by the breath of the mouth of the Almighty. Turn to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. And the Apostle Paul says to the Thessalonians, some of whom were giving up their jobs because they thought the Lord was coming back again soon. And he says, there's something else to come. The man of sin is going to come. The Antichrist is going to come. And when he comes, he will be powerful. Turn to the book of Revelation, chapter 17 and 19, and you will find there that at the very end of times, you think of Haman and his 10 sons. Well, think also of the Antichrist and the 10 kingdoms that support him. And think of what's still to come. Will God preserve his people? Yes, he will. He will preserve his people. The future Haman will be destroyed at the coming again of the Lord Jesus Christ. He was set up by the man who called himself King of Kings and Lord of Lords. But the King of Kings and Lord of Lords is still to come. And he will preserve his people. We never read our Bible just for the story. By the Spirit of God, we read our Bible for what God wants to tell us now, in our lives, in our time. What should come first for us? And the purposes God has for the whole of human history. A terrible tribulation is coming. I'm not going to debate with you dispensationalism. I don't care if you're pre or post or mid or whatever you are. I do believe in the rapture of the church, but I believe in the tribulation also, the time of Jacob's trouble. And I believe that it will only end with the coming again of the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. May God bless his word to us this morning. Amen. Amen. We have a closing hymn.